I always trusted her. Our life together had its ups and downs, but trust, the backbone of any marriage, never faltered. At least, not until recently. It started small, hushed whispers behind closed doors, phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, her smile vanishing into that blank look she gave when she didn't want to talk. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it might be stress or something work-related. Maybe even a surprise party for one of the kids. I wasn't prepared for what I found. It hit me one evening when I grabbed the tablet we often shared. I wasn't snooping, just looking for an article to read, but the email popped up right there, and my heart stopped. The exchange was with her sister. It didn't take long to figure it out. My wife was planning to become a surrogate for her sister's baby. Everything was there: doctor's visits, contracts, plans to start hormone treatments. It was all set in motion. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. A knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't just the decision itself, it was the silence. She hadn't told me, hadn't included me in something so massive. It felt like I'd been erased from my own marriage. I closed the tablet, my mind buzzing with a mix of anger and disbelief. This wasn't a small thing, it changed everything. That night, I confronted her. I asked her how she could plan something like this behind my back. Her response gutted me. She was calm, almost detached, as she told me it was her body, her choice. That phrase echoed in my head for hours afterward. I wasn't part of the conversation, not part of her reasoning. It didn't seem to matter how I felt about it. Her mind was made up, and she hadn't even bothered to give me a say. The days that followed were unbearable. The house felt colder, heavier, as though something essential had been ripped away. We stopped talking, stopped even looking at each other. I spent my evenings in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, asking myself how we'd gotten here. When had she stopped seeing me as her partner? When had I become a background character in her life? Then it got worse. One afternoon in the kitchen, she told me she was already pregnant. Just like that. No build-up, no apology, just a quiet, matter-of-fact statement that shattered what little was left of my composure. I felt sick. She'd done it. She'd gone ahead and changed our lives without me. I tried to make sense of it, but the anger was louder than any rational thought. I told her it was over. I said I couldn't stay in a marriage where my feelings didn't matter, where decisions that affected our family were made behind my back. I laid it out for her: stop this, or we're done. A part of me hoped she'd realize what she was risking. That she'd see how much she was tearing us apart. But she didn't flinch. She said nothing, and her silence told me everything I needed to know. From that moment, I withdrew. I focused on work, on the kids, on anything that didn't involve her. The tension in the house became suffocating. The kids picked up on it. I could see their confusion when they looked at us, their parents, once so close, now strangers living under the same roof. I wanted to protect them, to keep things as normal as possible, but how do you hide cracks that run this deep? At night, when the house was quiet, I found myself staring at the family photos on the wall. Smiling faces looked back at me, faces that belonged to people I barely recognized anymore. How had it come to this? I thought about the promises we'd made to each other on our wedding day, promises to share everything, to face life together, no matter how hard it got. Those promises felt hollow now. She had made her choice. I wasn't sure if I even knew who she was anymore. I tried to push the anger away, but it lingered, curling around me like smoke. It wasn't just anger at her, it was anger at myself. I had trusted her, believed in her, and now that trust had turned into something ugly. I felt trapped in a house that no longer felt like home, sharing a life with someone who no longer felt like my wife. By the end of that week, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. Love, I realized, wasn't enough. Not when respect was gone. Not when I couldn't look at her without feeling betrayed. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I made my decision. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. Filing for divorce wasn't a decision I made lightly. Sitting in my car outside the attorney's office, I wondered how it had come to this. I hadn't married her expecting perfection, but I had believed in partnership, in sharing everything, good and bad. Instead, she had shut me out of the most significant choice of our lives. When she told me she was pregnant, it felt like a final blow. I realized I couldn't be with someone who made life-altering decisions as if I didn't exist. I walked into the office with a hollow feeling in my chest, a mix of anger and regret. The attorney's questions blurred together: financials, custody arrangements, living situations. I nodded my way through it, feeling like a passenger in my own life. When I left, the papers in my hand felt heavier than they should have. I had chosen to end my marriage, but there was no sense of relief, only dread for what came next. Returning home that evening felt surreal. She was there, sitting at the dining table, sipping tea like nothing had changed. I placed the documents in front of her without saying a word. She looked at them, then at me, her face unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if she would say something, apologize, argue, anything, but she didn't. Instead, she pushed the papers aside and calmly said she wasn't leaving the house. Her words stung. She explained that she would stay because of the kids, that they needed stability, but all I heard was defiance. I realized then that this house would become a war zone. The days that followed were worse than I expected. We avoided each other as much as possible. She spent her time in the living room, curled up with a blanket, scrolling on her phone. I stayed in the kitchen or locked myself in the guest room. The tension was unbearable, an invisible weight pressing down on the house. The kids noticed. They weren't old enough to understand, but they sensed the change. Our daughter started asking why mommy and daddy weren't smiling anymore. I tried to reassure her, but the words felt empty even as I said them. It didn't take long for her sister to get involved. She showed up at our doorstep, her face red with anger, clutching a purse like it was a weapon. Before I could say a word, she launched into a tirade. She accused me of being selfish, of abandoning my wife when she was doing something selfless and beautiful. I stood there, stunned, as she berated me on my own front porch. I wanted to argue back, to tell her this wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about trust, respect, and everything my wife had thrown away. But I couldn't get a word in. Finally, I told her to leave, slamming the door behind her. Through the window, I saw her storming back to her car, furiously texting someone, probably my wife. That night, my wife confronted me. She told me her sister had every right to be upset, that I was being petty and cruel. I didn't respond. I had run out of words. Arguing felt pointless, she wasn't listening. Instead, I let her say what she wanted, her voice rising until she finally stopped, realizing I wasn't engaging. Her silence didn't feel victorious, it just felt empty. The next morning, I made breakfast for the kids. They sat quietly, eating their cereal while the tension buzzed around us. When my son asked if mommy and daddy were mad at each other, I froze. How do you explain something like this to a child? I told him everything was fine, that sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. The house felt like a prison, every room thick with unspoken words. My wife started asking for my help, simple things like carrying groceries or grabbing something from the car. Each time, I said no. It wasn't out of spite, I just couldn't bring myself to pretend everything was normal. She had made her choice, and now she was dealing with the consequences. I didn't owe her anything. Her sister and brother-in-law escalated things further. One evening, they called me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her brother-in-law's voice was calm, but every word dripped with judgment. He told me I needed to be there for my wife, that this was a gift she was giving to their family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They talked about her as though she was some kind of saint, while I was the villain for not falling in line. I hung up mid-sentence, my hands shaking with anger. That night, I sat alone in the darkened living room, staring at nothing. I thought about what they had said. Was I being selfish? Was I letting my pride ruin everything? But then I remembered the silence, the way she'd shut me out. This wasn't about her being a surrogate. This was about the fact that she had made a choice without me, without even respecting me enough to include me. I couldn't forgive that. The weeks blurred together. Every day felt the same: work, home, silence. I focused on the kids as much as I could, but even that was hard. Every time I looked at them, I saw the cracks forming in their world. They didn't deserve this. None of us did. Eventually, I decided to move out of the master bedroom permanently. I dragged my things into the guest room and closed the door behind me. It felt symbolic, in a way, like I was drawing a line in the sand. She noticed, of course. That night, I heard her crying softly in the other room. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything she'd done, every choice she'd made without me. Whatever sympathy I felt evaporated. The next morning, I found an email from my attorney. The divorce process was moving forward. There was no turning back now. I wondered if she realized how serious this was, how much she had pushed me away. I wondered if she even cared. As I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the email, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. This wasn't how I had imagined my life would go. But maybe, in the long run, it would be better for everyone. She had made her choice. Now, I was making mine. The day she went into labor came sooner than I expected. It had been months since we'd spoken beyond a few strained sentences, months of tension so thick I thought I might suffocate. I woke up to the sound of her sister pounding on the door, shouting about hospital bags and car keys. I barely had time to register what was happening before they were gone, leaving behind an empty house and a hollow silence. I sat in the kitchen for hours after they left, staring at the coffee growing cold in my hands. She was bringing a child into the world, a child that wasn't mine, a child I hadn't agreed to. The betrayal felt fresh all over again. I wondered how she felt, if she was scared or excited, or if she even thought about me at all. I hated myself for caring. By the time she came home a few days later, everything in the house felt different. The air carried an unfamiliar weight, like the walls themselves knew what had happened. I heard her come in, the baby crying softly in the car seat she placed by the door. I stayed in the guest room, pretending not to hear. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, to see the reality of what she'd done. The kids, of course, were ecstatic. They had no idea what was going on, no context for why this new baby existed. All they knew was that their mother had brought home someone tiny and fascinating. Our daughter, especially, couldn't stop talking about her new brother. The word made my stomach churn. I felt sick with resentment, at her sister, at the situation that had swallowed up my family. Most of all, I hated that I was the only one who seemed to see how broken everything had become. That night, I overheard her talking to the kids as she put them to bed. She told them the baby was only staying for a little while, that he was going to live with their aunt soon. Her voice was soft, almost cheerful, but I could hear the cracks underneath. She was trying to spin a story for them, a story where everything was fine. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to go in there and tear apart the lie she was building, to tell the kids what really happened, but I couldn't do it. They deserved to be happy, even if the happiness was built on a foundation of secrets. The next morning, I finally saw the baby. He was asleep in a bassinet in the living room, tiny and unaware of the chaos his existence had caused. For a moment, I felt something unexpected, a pang of guilt. None of this was his fault. He hadn't asked to be part of my wife's choices, or to be born into a house that resented him. I turned away quickly, ashamed of myself for feeling anything other than anger. The days passed slowly after that. My wife stayed home, recovering from the birth while her sister visited constantly. I tried to stay out of their way, spending more time at work or taking the kids out just to avoid being in the same room as them. But it wasn't enough. Everywhere I turned, the baby was there, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The kids, oblivious to the tension, started asking questions. Our daughter was the first. She wanted to know why the baby was here, why he wasn't going to stay forever. I stumbled through an explanation, telling her it was something special that Mommy was doing for Aunt Sarah. She accepted it without question, her innocence a painful contrast to the reality I was living. But our son was older, and he wasn't so easily convinced. He asked if Mommy and Daddy were fighting, if the baby was the reason we weren't happy anymore. I didn't know how to answer him. I hated her for putting me in that position. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon. I had just come home from work, soaked and tired, only to find my wife in the kitchen with her sister and brother-in-law. They were laughing, sipping coffee as the baby cooed softly in his bassinet. It was like walking into a nightmare, a picture of a happy family that didn't include me. I stood there, frozen, as her brother-in-law looked up and greeted me like nothing was wrong. He asked if I wanted coffee, his voice casual, as if I hadn't been pushed out of my own home. I couldn't take it anymore. I told them to leave. My voice shook as I spoke, anger bubbling up in a way I couldn't control. Her sister looked at me like I was insane, asking what my problem was, but I ignored her. I told them this wasn't their house, that they had no right to sit here and pretend everything was normal. My wife didn't say a word as they gathered their things and left, her silence louder than any argument we'd ever had. When they were gone, I turned to her. I asked her how long she thought this could go on, how long she could live in the wreckage of what we used to have and pretend it was fine. She didn't answer. She just looked at me with those same empty eyes, the ones that had haunted me since the day I found out. It was like talking to a stranger. That night, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. It wasn't home. It was a battlefield, and I was losing. I didn't know where I was going or what came next, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep living like this. She had made her choice. Now I had to make mine, even if it meant walking away from everything I'd built. As I drove away, the rain pounding against the windshield, I thought about the kids. I hated the idea of leaving them behind, but I also knew they deserved better than the life we'd created. They deserved parents who could look at each other without bitterness, a home that didn't feel like a prison. I told myself I was doing this for them, that someday they would understand. But as I looked at the empty road ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a part of myself behind. The silence after I left the house should have been a relief. Instead, it gnawed at me, following me everywhere. I stayed with an old friend for a few days, crashing on his couch while I figured out what to do next. He didn't pry or ask questions, just handed me a beer and let me sit there in silence. I appreciated it more than I could say. The space gave me time to think, but thinking wasn't what I wanted. My mind kept drifting back to the house, to the kids, to the baby who wasn't mine. I tried to focus on the anger, the betrayal, because it was easier than admitting how much I missed my children. I hated the idea of them going to sleep without me there to check on them, to make sure they were okay. I wondered if they were asking for me, if my wife had bothered to explain where I'd gone. The thought of her twisting the truth made my blood boil. On the third day, my lawyer called. He told me my wife had officially responded to the divorce papers and wasn't contesting anything, not yet, at least. That should have been good news, but it wasn't. It meant she wasn't fighting for me, for us. She was just letting it happen. Part of me hoped for resistance, for something that showed she cared enough to fight. But there was nothing. It felt like another door slamming shut. I went back to the house later that week to see the kids. My wife had agreed to let me pick them up, though her tone over the phone had been cold, almost robotic. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was her sister's car parked out front. My chest tightened. I wasn't ready to see her. I wasn't ready to see anyone but my kids. I knocked on the door, and my son opened it. The sight of his face, so excited to see me, hit me harder than I expected. He hugged me tightly, like he was afraid I might disappear again. I wanted to tell him I wasn't going anywhere, but the words stuck in my throat. My daughter appeared next, holding her stuffed animal, her eyes wide as she looked up at me. She asked why I had left, her voice small and uncertain. I promised her that I would explain everything one day, but that today we were going to have fun. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to happiness. My wife appeared in the doorway a few moments later. She didn't say anything, didn't look at me. She just handed me the kids' bags and stepped aside. Her sister was there too, standing in the living room with her arms crossed, watching me like I was the villain in some play she was directing. I ignored both of them and focused on the kids. I told them to grab their coats, and we left. That afternoon was a blur of playgrounds, ice cream, and movie marathons. I tried to cram as much joy as I could into a few short hours, desperate to give them a day where everything felt normal. They laughed, they played, and for a little while, I let myself believe that everything would be okay. But as the day came to an end, reality crept back in. I had to take them home. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a light in the living room. I helped the kids out of the car, walking them to the door. My son hugged me again, whispering that he wanted me to come inside. My heart twisted, but I told him I couldn't. My wife opened the door and took the kids inside without a word, her expression unreadable. As I turned to leave, I heard her sister's voice from inside, loud enough that it was meant for me to hear. She said something about me abandoning my family and being a coward. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, my fists clenched at my sides. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she didn't understand anything. But I didn't. I walked back to my car, the weight of those words settling on me like stones. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to clear my head, but the anger wouldn't let go. They were rewriting the story, turning me into the villain, the man who walked away. I knew it wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Perception always wins. A few days later, the unexpected happened. The biological father of the baby showed up at my friend's apartment. I didn't recognize him at first, just a tall man in his early 30s, standing on the doorstep with an apologetic look on his face. He introduced himself and said he wanted to talk. I almost slammed the door in his face, but curiosity got the better of me. I let him in. We sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. He told me he hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that he never thought it would cause so much damage. I stared at him, wondering how someone could be so naive. He explained that he and my wife's sister had tried to have children for years, and that this baby was everything they'd hoped for. He said he wanted to make things right, to include me in this process somehow. The suggestion made my blood boil. Include me? Include me in what? In raising a child that wasn't mine, in pretending everything was fine? I told him to leave. I told him that whatever arrangement they had made with my wife was their business, but it wasn't mine. I didn't care how much they wanted this baby, it had come at the cost of my marriage, my trust, my family. He looked at me with pity as he stood to leave, and I hated him for it. After he was gone, I sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The anger I'd been holding onto for so long felt like it might swallow me whole. I thought about my kids, about the life I was trying to rebuild for them. I couldn't let this break me. I wouldn't let it. Over the next few weeks, I started setting boundaries. I told my wife, through our lawyers, that her sister and brother-in-law were no longer welcome in the house when I came to see the kids. I refused to let them keep turning me into the villain, to let them rewrite the truth. If they wanted to play happy family, they could do it somewhere else. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of something. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let them destroy me. Not anymore. Seeing my kids became my anchor. Every time I picked them up, their hugs reminded me of what mattered most. It wasn't the betrayal, the bitterness, or the wreckage my wife had caused. It was them, their laughter, their trust, their need for stability. I wasn't going to let her choices ruin what I had left. But my wife wasn't finished. It started small, passive-aggressive comments during pickups, lingering glances that made it clear she wanted me to feel guilty. Then, she escalated. One evening, when I dropped the kids off, she told me she needed to talk. I almost refused, but something about the way she said it made me stay. She started with the same tired words I'd heard a dozen times, about how what she'd done was selfless, how she had done it for her sister. But then she shifted. She accused me of abandoning her, of walking out when things got hard. She said the kids would grow up resenting me for leaving. I stood there, biting my tongue, knowing any response I gave would only feed the fire. It wasn't worth it. I left without saying a word, but her accusation stuck to me like tar. The next morning, I got a call from my lawyer. My wife wanted to revisit the custody arrangement. She claimed I wasn't emotionally stable to have the kids for overnight visits. I felt my hands shake as I listened. I had expected manipulation, but using the kids against me, that was a line I didn't think she'd cross. I spent the rest of the day pacing the small apartment I now called home, trying to figure out what to do. My lawyer reassured me that her claims were weak, but that didn't make it hurt any less. She was attacking me as a father now, as if trying to strip away the last part of me that mattered. When I saw the kids again, I hugged them a little tighter. My son asked why I seemed sad, and I told him I was just tired. He nodded solemnly, as if he understood far more than he should. Kids always do. It made me hate her for putting them in the middle of this. The turning point came 2 weeks later. My wife's sister showed up at my apartment. I hadn't seen her since the last argument, and I had no desire to see her now. But she insisted on talking. She stood there in the doorway, her expression unusually soft, as if she'd finally realized how far things had gone. She started with an apology. She admitted that they had underestimated how much their decision would hurt me, how deeply it would fracture everything. For a moment, I almost believed she was sincere. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me my wife was struggling, that she regretted what had happened and wanted to make things right. I didn't even know what that meant. I asked her if my wife sent her here. She hesitated before shaking her head, but I knew better. I told her to leave, slamming the door before she could say anything else. My chest felt tight. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breathing. Regret? She was talking about regret now, after everything she'd done? After dragging me through months of this nightmare? I didn't know if I felt angrier at her or at myself for letting it get to me. 2 days later, my wife called. I didn't answer the first 3 times, but on the 4th, I picked up. Her voice was quieter than usual. She told me she wanted to talk, face to face, and that it wasn't about the custody arrangement or the lawyers. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself it was for the kids, that I needed to hear her out to figure out where we stood. But a part of me, the part that still felt hollow, wanted to understand why she was doing this. We met at a small diner halfway between my apartment and the house. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen her. I sat across from her, waiting for her to speak. She started slowly, stumbling over her words. She said she hadn't expected things to spiral the way they did. She admitted that she had been selfish, that she had shut me out when she should have trusted me. For a brief second, I saw the woman I used to love, the woman I'd built a life with. But then she shifted the blame again, saying she thought I would understand eventually, that I would come around. That was when I realized she still didn't get it. She wanted to justify what she'd done, to tie it up in a neat little bow and call it a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A choice she made over and over again, knowing exactly what it would cost. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing at all. I told her calmly that I wasn't coming around. I said she had made her decision, and now we were both living with the consequences. I told her I would always be there for the kids, but I was done trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But she didn't. She just nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. I stood up and left her sitting there, staring into her coffee like it held the answers. The drive back felt different. Lighter, somehow. I realized that I had been carrying the weight of her choices for too long, blaming myself, wondering what I could have done differently. But it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. She had broken us, and I had finally let go. When I saw the kids that weekend, I felt more present than I had in months. I played catch with my son in the park while my daughter picked flowers nearby. They laughed, unburdened by the mess their parents had created. I watched them, and for the first time, I felt hopeful. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. That night, as I tucked them into bed, my son asked if Mommy and Daddy were friends again. I told him the truth, that sometimes grown-ups don't stay friends, but that it doesn't mean they don't love their kids. He nodded, satisfied with the answer, and drifted off to sleep. I sat on the couch after they went to bed, looking at the quiet house around me. I thought about everything that had happened, everything I'd lost. But I also thought about what I still had, my kids, my freedom, and the chance to rebuild. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was going to be okay. It's strange how quickly time moves after a storm. At first, every day felt like a fight, a struggle just to keep my head above water. But then, slowly, life began to settle into something that resembled normal, a new kind of normal, but one I could live with. My wife and I finalized the divorce within a few months. There were no surprises, no last-minute battles, just signatures on a stack of papers that made it all official. I expected to feel something the day I walked out of the lawyer's office, but I didn't. It was just, done. The end of one chapter, the start of another. Co-parenting, as much as I hated the word, turned out to be easier than I thought. We set clear schedules, boundaries, and rules. She stayed in the house with the kids, which made sense for now. I wasn't ready to fight over bricks and mortar. My focus was on my children, on making my time with them count. I picked them up every other weekend and spent 2 evenings a week with them. Those days became sacred, an escape from the weight of everything that had happened. My son, always observant, asked fewer questions as time went on. He adjusted quicker than I thought he would, though sometimes I caught him watching me, as if trying to understand something I couldn't explain. My daughter was younger, and to her, this new reality was just how life worked. She didn't remember a time when Mommy and Daddy lived under the same roof, and part of me was grateful for that. I didn't want her to remember the worst parts of it. One day, as I sat in the park watching them play, I realized how far I'd come. The anger that had consumed me wasn't gone, but it didn't control me anymore. It was a dull ache, a reminder of what I'd been through, what I'd survived. I watched my kids laugh and chase each other under the afternoon sun, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The strangest part of rebuilding your life is learning how to trust again, not just others, but yourself. I spent months second-guessing every decision, wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have been better, smarter, stronger. But the truth is, none of that mattered. I couldn't change the past. All I could do was build a better future. My wife, for her part, seemed to find her own version of normal too. We spoke only when necessary, usually through texts or quick phone calls about the kids. It was civil, even cordial at times, but it wasn't friendship. I couldn't let it be. Too much had been broken for me to pretend otherwise. Then, one afternoon, she called me. It was unusual for her to reach out directly, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something told me to answer. Her voice was calm, almost hesitant. She said she wanted to meet, just for coffee. No arguments, no lawyers. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. We met at the same diner where we'd had our last real conversation months earlier. She looked different this time, less guarded, more human. She started by thanking me for how I'd handled things with the kids. She said they were lucky to have me, that I'd done a good job keeping their world stable when everything else had fallen apart. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. Then she told me something I didn't expect. She said she was sorry. Not the half-hearted apologies I'd heard before, not the excuses or justifications. Just a quiet, simple admission that she'd hurt me in ways she could never undo. She said she hadn't realized the cost of her choices until it was too late. I didn't forgive her, not completely. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something I owed her. But I let go of the resentment I'd been carrying. Holding onto it didn't serve me anymore. I didn't tell her that, though. Instead, I thanked her for saying it. And for the first time, it felt like we were two people standing on even ground, looking at the ruins of what we'd built together, and accepting it for what it was. After that, things got easier. We weren't friends, but we were no longer enemies. The kids noticed the difference almost immediately. My son stopped asking if we were mad at each other. My daughter stopped drawing pictures of a house with two separate sides. They started to feel normal again, and that was enough for me. One evening, after dropping the kids off, I drove to the edge of town, where the hills overlooked the city lights. It was a place I hadn't visited in years, not since before I was married. I sat on the hood of my car, staring out at the skyline, and let the silence wash over me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about her, or the past, or the pain. I was thinking about the future, about what I wanted to build for myself and for my kids. I thought about the life we'd had, the choices that had led us here, and the lessons I'd learned. Love, I realized, isn't just about the good moments. It's about what happens when things fall apart, how you choose to pick up the pieces and move forward. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. When I got back to my apartment, I found a drawing my daughter had left behind. It was simple, a stick figure version of me holding hands with her and her brother. Above us, she'd written two words, "Daddy's happy." For the first time in a long time, I believed it. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and watched the sunrise from my small balcony. The world felt new again, full of possibility. I didn't have everything figured out, but I didn't need to. I had my kids, my freedom, and the strength to keep moving forward. Sometimes, life breaks you apart so you can put yourself back together stronger. I had lost so much, but I'd also gained something I hadn't expected, a sense of who I was, and who I wanted to be. I wasn't defined by her choices anymore. I wasn't defined by what I'd lost. I was defined by what I still had, and what I was building for myself and my children. And that was enough.